So today I am going to be talking to you about the idea of being the change. Now, this might be a phrase that you've heard before. It's quite a famous phrase when it comes to taking action in the world. But I want to just spend this session with you looking a little bit about what that means, in particular in terms of your own life and your own passions and interests, and how we can start to connect our passion with our purpose when it comes to taking action on climate change. So I'm going to share my screen and just go through some ideas with you, some videos, a few provocation questions, and let's see how this lands with you. And hopefully, as you're going through, please do press pause when I sort of instruct you to have a little conversation, either with a neighbour or with your whole class, and feel free to come back and look at this video another time. So my name is Rachel Musson and I am a former teacher. I was a secondary school teacher for quite a long time, and now I run an organisation called Thoughtbox Education. And we work with schools all over the world to help young people become activated and empowered in how to create a thriving future for people and planet. And so we work with people from all over the place, from many different countries and cultures, but we all share the same idea. We all want to live in a beautiful planet. We want to sustain this extraordinary life that we have going. And for many of us, mental health is one of the biggest challenges, because it can feel really overwhelming when we start to look at the extent of what's happening in the world. So many of us, young and old, can feel really overwhelmed. But I want to just sit with you today and explore some of the thoughts and feelings we might be having, and also really help you to start to tap into what you can do to be the change that you wish to see in the world. Now, when I think about young people and climate change, this image comes to mind. So many thousands of young people, millions in fact, across the world, have taken to the streets, have taken to Zoom and online places to protest and to say, look, governments, we need to do something. We're hearing the climate science, we're hearing the urgency of what is happening on our planet, and we need to do something. But protest isn't for everybody. And you might not feel that that's right for you. You might feel that there's many other things you want to do. And it's important for us to recognize that there are many different ways for us to create change. So when I think about young people and climate change, I also think about pictures like this. I think about young people I know who are planting trees in their schools or in their local areas. I think about my next door neighbour, who's on the top right, Maya, who has written to all of the supermarkets in the area that we live to ask them why they're using plastic bags when they don't need to. I think about young men like Jin, who stands up in his assemblies every few weeks and tells young people around him some of the other things that they can do to get involved in that local area. I think about people like Jessie Stevens, who lives in Devon, who is an avid cyclist, and she decided that she was going to cycle all the way up to Glasgow for the COP26 summit last November. All of these people, they're very ordinary, everyday teenagers, but what they all have learned to do is work out their passion, what it is that really gets them moving, and their purpose, and how to connect the two. And that really is what being the change is all about, is doing things that we're really motivated by, but actually have a powerful outcome at the other side. Now, I just want to ask you a question, which it might seem a strange question to ask, but I want to ask you, what sort of stories are you hearing about the world that we live in, and in particular about how to respond to the climate crisis? Because there are three stories that we're told constantly, three stories really that exist, but we tend to be told one much more than others. So we have the business as usual story. And this story is that, yes, there's a problem. Yes, lots of things need to change, but we can just carry on as we are and focus on green tech or focus on green issues, but just continue as we are. And that's a very, very strong story, in particular in our governments, in particular in our media. Another story that you may be feeling yourself, you may have heard other people talking about, you may be starting to see, is the story that's called The Great Unraveling. And this is a little bit of a depressing story. It's a story of we're all doomed. There's nothing we can do. It's too late. It's all going wrong. There's nothing that any of us can do. I'm not going to bother. There's no point. And unfortunately, that story is quite a powerful story. You know, if we think about all the films that we watch a lot of doomsday films, a lot of apocalyptic films. And so that story is quite easy for us to tap into, especially if we start to see inaction from some of our governments when we know that we've got to be a little bit more urgent. But the story I'm really interested in is the story that isn't told as much as it needs to be, but it's a story of huge, huge change. It's happening across the world. It's happening on your doorstep. It's happening in your neighborhood. It's happening in your country, in your community, and it's happening right across the world. And this story is called The Great Turning, and it's the story of doing things differently. Now, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of organizations, thousands of organizations across the UK doing things differently. There are millions of people doing things differently. And this story is the most exciting story because what it tells us is all of the answers that we need, all of the solutions for responding to the climate crisis and creating and sustaining a healthy, thriving planet, they exist. We know what to do. And there are people and there are organizations out there doing it. They're not waiting for the government to catch up, they're doing it. And so I really invite you to not only start to look for those stories, because they are there when you start looking, but to be part of those stories. Because yes, you might say that the first story is easier. You might say that the second story is easier. I don't know whether it's easier because we don't have to do much, we just give up. But the third story is the place where the energy lies. And the third story, as far as I'm concerned, is the only story worth telling. So we're going to look a little bit in this session at how to start to become part of the Great Turning. Now, those of you who connected in any way to COP26 was the climate summit that was held in Glasgow in the UK in November, when representatives from countries from all across the world came together with the sole purpose of talking about the climate crisis and shared agreements of what we can do to respond. Now, it's a very complicated process when you've got so many different ideas and so many different people coming together. But one of the things that stood out for me time and time again in these conferences is the wisdom of young people. And in particular, these three young women stood out for me who all had quite a daunting task of standing up and speaking to a huge number of delegates across the political spectrum, but also to people across the world. And they all stood up and they invited everybody to not do, not tell, not act, but listen. And they invited us to listen to different things. We had a very powerful young climate activist from Brazil, Chai Suri, who invited us to listen to the earth and actually listen to the needs of the natural world around us. We had a wonderful speech from Brianna Fruin, who talked to us about listening to the people, listening to those people on the ground who know what to do, those in the Great Turning, as we were just looking at. And then we had a very powerful closing speech from Elizabeth Watuti, who said, listen with your hearts. So often when we're talking about climate change, we don't let it in. We don't let ourselves feel the emotions that we're feeling. And actually, when we start to take action without feeling first, those actions are not authentic and those actions are probably the wrong actions. So I'm going to invite you to hold the wisdom of those three young people in your own experience, in your own actions. We often want to do because we think that doing is how we achieve change. But sometimes it's important to step back a little bit. And we talk a lot in Thoughtbox about how sometimes progress is a step backwards. Because if you take a little moment to step back and pause, to look at the bigger picture, to listen to some of the things that are going on, when you step forward and act, you're stepping forward with a lot more wisdom and a lot more power in the actions that you're taking. So being the change does start by stopping. It starts by stopping doing and actually taking a moment to listen and to sort of think about ways of doing and being. So climate activism, we often think it's about doing and lots of action, but I really invite you in this session to recognize it's as much about who you are and how you are as what you do. So when we think about being the change, I want to ask you personally, and this is just for you to be reflecting on your own, who are you? And what are your beliefs? What are your values? What matters to you? And then I want you to start to think about, what do you want to do? Or what is it that you want to see change in the world? What is it perhaps about the climate crisis that you just get really frustrated about, or that you want to see happen? Do you want to have an end of plastic, single-use plastics? Do you want to have ocean cleaning? Do you want to have something to save the coral reef degradation? Do you want to have fossil fuel stopped? Do you want to have Do you want to have recycling bins in your school? Do you want to have electric bikes that people can hire in your neighborhood? Whatever it is you want to do, think about that. But I also want you to think a little bit about who you are. Because when it comes to being the change, the way that change really is powerfully enacted is when those two things come together. Because then everything you do is actually coming from a place of what's called authenticity. You're not just talking the talk, you're actually feeling it too. So I'm going to just teach you, or remind you, if you know this already, of what I would say are the 3 core tools for your toolkit for being a change maker. And they are to feel, to think, and to connect. So we're going to just take a moment to look at what they mean. So to start with, I really invite you to feel. I invite you to engage with how you're feeling about the world, about the state of the world, about things that are happening around you, and start to really develop your emotional intelligence. I'm going to invite you to learn to think. Now, we're all quite good at speaking and talking, but how often do we think deeply and critically? And I want to really encourage you to develop this because it's quite a powerful tool to have in your toolkit. And finally, to connect your passion to your purpose and to connect to some of the bigger stories around you. So let's take a moment to dissect those 3 things and think about what they mean. So feeling. Developing our emotional intelligence. We need to start to connect with how we're feeling because our emotions really matter and they're a vital part of who we are in the world. And actually, when we start to connect to our feelings, what makes us tick, those kind of churny things going on inside us, that is where we can really start to create change. Now, as a young person growing up in 2022, the world is overwhelming at times because there is so much going on. Now, not only do we have the pressures, or you have the pressures, I've been through this, of being a teenager and all of the hormonal changes that are going on, you also have so many of the stresses that school bring in terms of workload and exams and social issues. Then we have the big pressures of a climate crisis and so many of the other social and emotional sort of distress that's happening in our communities. And so I want you to really just take a moment to sort of pat yourself on the head a little bit and say, gosh, it's not surprised I feel a little bit like this sometimes, because this is a lot. It's not just a lot for young people, it's a lot for any of us. And it's not surprising that sometimes we feel tempted to just put a head under the duvet, go back to bed, ignore it all and pretend it's not happening because it's overwhelming. And our emotions play a really powerful role in how we are able to respond or not to some of these issues. Now, the climate emergency is something that we can call an emotional smoothie. I love this phrase. It's a phrase from Clover Hogan, who I'm going to introduce you to in a second, because she says that we will feel totally different emotions at totally different times, and sometimes a whole mix of them all in one go. So we might feel really energized and really anxious at the same time, or we might feel quite terrified, but also quite motivated at the same time, or we might feel apathetic, but also activated. And so I want you to just also recognize that it's okay to feel however you are feeling. The emotions are a roller coaster, not just when we're thinking about the climate crisis, but in everyday life. We can, have a plethora of emotions in a single hour, never mind in our lifetime. And so part of the self-care in this space is to just be kind to yourself and say, it's okay that I'm feeling like this. So how are you feeling today? Now, again, our emotions change. I'm going to ask you this question right now, or whatever time it is. You might feel totally different at the end of this session, or totally different than you did this morning. And I just want you to connect with how you're feeling today, because part of this work is just actually checking in every now and then and think, right, how am I feeling right now? So you might be feeling totally apathetic, indifferent, or numb to climate change. You might just not be letting it in. You might be feeling today a sense of motivation. You might be activated and empowered. You might be feeling totally overwhelmed. You might be really anxious and just feeling disempowered. There's nothing you can do about any of this. You might be feeling incredibly angry and frustrated or agitated at what you see is not happening around you, and perhaps a feeling of powerlessness in that. So just take a moment, and if you want to, you can press pause in your classroom, and you can have 4 corners of the room. And I invite you, if this is appropriate, you can go and stand in one of those 4 corners. And you might also decide to sort of stand halfway between some of them, or more towards a corner, but not totally in the corner. And if you are doing this by moving, when you've moved, take a moment to talk to some of the people next to you. And then as a class, perhaps your teacher can invite a couple of you to share why you're feeling like that, and what some of the other thoughts and feelings are in the classroom. So feel free to pause, but if you don't want to pause, you can just take a moment for yourself and think, how am I feeling right now? So I mentioned this lady, Clover Hogan, and I'm just going to take a moment to just introduce her again. She's a young climate activist. She's in her early 20s, and she has started an organization called Force of Nature. And she really helps a lot of young people to deal with what's called eco-anxiety or climate anxiety, which is a high-level state of mental, physical, and or emotional distress in response to the changes in the climate. Now, I have a lot of eco-anxiety. I feel very anxious and overwhelmed sometimes, but I want to just talk to you in a second about why that's really healthy to be feeling these feelings. Now, one of the things that Clover says in her TED Talk, and I have got a link here if you want to watch it later, she says that young people have not created this reality, and yet we've inherited it, and yet we are told that we are the last generation with the chance to save the fate of humanity. Now, if this doesn't sound like an apocalyptic film heroine's role, I don't know what does, but take a moment to just think, flipping heck, that is not okay. That is not what young people need to be given, and that's certainly not your role to do that. And so it's not surprising that so many of us are feeling that total overwhelm with the scale of what we're being asked to do. But I want to just invite you to feel comforted by your anxiety, which might sound like a strange thing. But eco-anxiety or climate anxiety is a very natural response. We feel anxious because we care. We care deeply about the health and well-being of the planet and the people in it. We really care about the species that are threatened. We really care about the trees that are being cut down. We really care about the spaces that are being polluted. So of course we feel anxious when we see this happening. It's actually a very, very natural response. And it would probably be more worrying for us to not be feeling anxious, if that makes any sense. So actually, I see eco-anxiety is very healthy because it helps us to really connect with the emotions of the climate crisis. And actually, a really interesting woman called Caroline Hickman, who's a psychologist, she works a lot with young people. She's changed the phrase eco-anxiety to be eco-empathy. We feel these big emotions because we care. But the word anxiety is quite an inward-facing emotion. When we're anxious, we often just kind of put our heads under the pillow and don't know what to do. But when we're empathic, when we're feeling empathy, it's an outward-facing emotion. We use these emotions to do something, to connect to something. And that's a really powerful place for being the change. So feeling our emotions is really important. Don't just push them aside and think, oh, I don't need to get, don't just spending the time thinking about that. And I have to say, we're not very good sometimes in our culture at being emotional, but I really encourage you to channel your emotions because they are a really positive tool for you to use. And they don't need to be positive. It's not all about being happy and activated. Sit in the discomfort because actually it's important to recognize that this does hurt and this is painful, but also to allow yourself to move through that emotional smoothie and turn that anxiety into action, which I'm going to talk about shortly. So that's tool number 1, feeling. Tool number 2 is thinking. Now, one of the things we started with Thought Box is just to really help young people to learn how to think not what to think. And it's such a powerful tool for you to be a critical thinker, because critical thinking allows you to step back and see the big picture. It allows you to think outside the box, be very creative and courageous with your thinking. And one of the things I love the most about critical thinking, it's an act of rebellion because it takes you off the directed path. Now, remember at the beginning, I showed you those 3 stories. The story of the business as usual is the mainstream story. And I really invite you to be a critical thinker and say, hang on, there's other things going on here. Let's look at the 3rd story, the story of the great turning. So being a critical thinker allows you to sort of weigh up what you're being shown and think, is there something else I can think about here? Let me step back and look a little bit more widely. Now, there are huge numbers of us in need of some critical thinking skills, and I see it on a daily basis, and I actually sort of start to feel quite motivated looking to find where critical thinking hasn't been activated, if you like. So here's a good example from the very wonderful National Geographic, who are a hugely influential organization supporting climate health and engagement with the natural world. But really, do we want to have a magazine that's talking to us about the impact of plastic pollution wrapped in not 1, but 2 layers of single-use plastic? Now, there is an example of critical thinking not being carried out by their team. Another example, fairly recently, when we had the G20 summit held in Cornwall at the end of last summer, I wanted to ask the question, why on earth are we as political leaders watching a display of the Red Arrow's aircraft flying just for our pleasure at a summit that's talking about the climate emergency when we know full well the devastating effect of fossil fuel extraction and pollution and how the aviation industry is really contributing to that? So there's another critical thinking activation that was not activated. Couple of examples for you. And again, with these slides, take a moment to pause, turn to the person next to you and talk about your thoughts. Here's a question. A tour company arranges a trip for 60 British tourists to spend a week on a deserted and unspoiled island. What critical thinking questions might you have about this? So press pause or just have a moment to think. Another one. A family decides to become much more eco-friendly. To begin, they throw away their cooker, their fridge, their washing machine, their toaster, and they replace them with some eco-friendly ones. Again, take a moment. What critical thinking questions might you have here? Now, critical thinking is all about paying attention, and it's about stepping back and looking at things in a slightly different way, or just asking some probing questions. Now, oftentimes in our busy lives, we live in what I would call an intentional way. And I use this picture of a man with his blinkers on, because we're just focusing on what's right ahead of us. It's very directional. We're very purposeful. We are just looking ahead. But what happens if we start to live a little bit more attentionally, and we look around us a little bit, and we pay attention, and we listen, and we think, and we reflect, and we adapt and respond to things that are happening not just right in front of our eyes? And there's where so often we can see critical thinking not happening in our communities and our societies. So I'll give an example. The UK government have recently announced that they want to be world leaders in climate education and climate action, and yet they okayed a North Sea oil drilling site. So there's a total mismatch, if you like, with what's being said and what's being done. And that's because there isn't this capacity to stand back and see the bigger picture happening there. Well, there's lots of other reasons as well why that's happening. So when we start to think critically, we pay attention to the big picture and the wider actions and consequences. And we really start to value the importance of practicing what we preach. Now, I cannot overestimate the importance of being authentic and standing by your beliefs. I think you've probably all met people in your lives who say one thing and do something totally different. And it means that we don't trust them. It means that when they do things, it feels fake. And being the change begins with actually tapping into your values, tapping into what is true to you and standing by that. So, you know, you might decide, I want to go and, I don't know, champion for everyone to stop bringing single-use plastic into school, but then when school finishes, you go and buy lots of takeaway food that all has single-use plastic in because you think, oh, that's just at school. So it's that's an action that might be really positive, but it's not authentic because you're not actually believing it enough to follow it through. Now, I'm not criticizing if you have started doing something like that, because any change is good. But what I am saying is the power of that change comes when you can do things that you don't even need to think about because they're so ingrained in what you believe. So standing by your beliefs and practicing what you're preaching. And again, when we start to think attentionally and live attentionally and think critically, we also recognize that we need to stop, look and listen, step back a little bit sometimes before we do things. And again, thinking about doing and being as both part of being a climate activist or being the change. And the third tool, so we've got feeling, thinking. The third tool is connecting. So connecting means to look at the big picture, learn to think in systems and start to find the connections. So one of the things I know a lot of us feel overwhelmed with when it comes to the climate crisis is just how many different problems there seem to be. It is overwhelming. And yet one of the most empowering things I ever learned in my life was to be a systems thinker, because a systems thinker helps you to understand that all these things going on, they're actually all connected and they're actually all part of the big picture. And if I focus on one part of it, one little bit here, is actually making a change in the whole thing. So, you know, we can look at the climate crisis and we can think, okay, we've got to think about plastic and waste and fossil fuels and travel and food and consumption and clothes and energy. And it's just overwhelming. But actually, if I just focus on cycling to school, it might feel that's one little change in one little area of a huge picture. But because of how systems work and because of how changing one part has ripple effects to change the whole, that change is really powerful. So I'm just going to take you through a couple of activities and exercises to understand a little bit more about systems thinking and also how to make connections between what you want to do and what you believe and a bigger picture. I'm just going to show you a little video that I really like because it's a good example of how one person can do something that can have big ripple effects on the wider world. So hopefully you can hear this.
Everybody knows about playing with dominoes, but what you may not know is that a domino can knock over another domino which is about 1.5 times larger. So what I have here is a chain of dominoes. Each one is 1.5 times larger than the previous one. And the smallest domino is about 5 millimeters high and 1 millimeter thick. And I will carefully place it. And there are 13 dominoes, and the largest domino, it weighs about 100 pounds and is more than 1 meter tall. Ready? Boom. That was 13 dominoes. If I had 29 dominoes, the last domino would be as tall as the Empire State Building.
Boom, indeed. Again, it's such a powerful video to show how one small action can have huge ripple effects. Now, as I said, the world's problems can probably seem so huge and overwhelming. We don't feel as individuals we have any capacity to do anything. But what happens if we just focus on being the change in one area, in one small part of the system, understanding that we all have potential as individuals to influence and have ripple effects on the world around us, whether that's in our local community, even in our family, in our class, in our town, in our school. And I always use the example of Greta Thunberg, who I know now is a very big figure, but the first thing that she did as a young 14-year-old is just sit on the street with a placard and actually look at the ripple effects that has created. We're not all Greta Thunbergs, but just understanding that that simple, tiny action had huge ripple effects. So when we're looking at some of the big issues happening around the world, part of the power that we can find ourselves is to understand how they all connect, because all of these issues are interconnected. And so rather than having to deal with the entire world's problems, we can just focus on one, and actually by focusing on that, it's having ripple effects on wider areas as well. Now, there's a video I've made about how to be a systems thinker that, again, there's a little link there that you can perhaps look at another time or on your own if you want to learn a little bit more about the skill of how to think in systems. So how do we as individuals decide what to focus on? How do we understand, or how do we go about connecting our passion with purpose? And we're going to just take a moment to meet a couple of friends of mine and think about how they have done this and what that means in terms of your own life. So here's a friend of mine, Rich, who lives in Totnes, where I'm based, and he used to play for Manchester United. He was in their youth team, and he was in the Champions League for quite a long time, and he was a very, very successful football player. And he was never satisfied with playing football, even though he was, touring the world and earning lots of money and theoretically being a success. It didn't align with his values. It didn't align with his beliefs. And so he listened to that gut feeling. He listened to his emotions, as we were talking about earlier. And he started to ask those critical questions. And he realized he needed to start connecting how he felt with what he was doing. And clearly being a footballer wasn't doing that for him. And so he left the profession and he moved to Devon, and he started up 2 businesses. He runs a zero waste shop. So he sells loads of food with no packaging. And he also is now a milkman. He sells vegan and non-dairy milks and has milk vans that go all around the local area and are now selling all over the UK. Because he listened to his gut, and he recognized that what he was doing wasn't aligned with his values. Another young woman, Lauren Singer, who is an American environmentalist, she just focused on cutting down her waste. So she chose to stop making waste that couldn't be recycled or reused. And in the little jar there, that's all of the waste that she threw away in a year. Anything that couldn't be recycled or reused, that was all that she had left. And Autumn Peltier, who is a young 17-year-old, she focused on water. She's from the First Nation of the Mantulian Island in Ontario, and she is a clean water activist. So she just really focused on helping her local water areas and rivers to be safe and clean from pollution. And these 2 women themselves are making huge ripple effects across the world, but they just focused on one thing, but doing something that every day motivated them. They weren't having to remember to care, they just cared innately. So I'm going to finally introduce you to a friend of mine, Yurak, who is a young woman from Peru. And she's going to tell her story. It's 10 minutes, this video, so you might want to just pause before you start and share any questions about things I've talked about so far. But when you're watching this video, I want you to think a little bit about how Yurak connected with those tools of feeling, of thinking and connecting. So what or how was she feeling? What was her burning question? And how did she turn her passion to purpose? And we'll come back after the video and explore this together.
We were talking about how fashion it could actually change the world. We hear so many people all over the place saying they are not into fashion because fashion, it's like vanity, it's shallow, it's only pretty girls, tall girls, skinny girls, or just for people who has this amount of money. So it's not connected to any kind of reality or creating empathy at all. And it's curious because what we do every day as humans is we eat and we get dressed. We don't go around naked. So even if you like it or if you don't like it or if you're aware of it or not, you do fashion. I'm an architect. I studied architecture and I did a semester abroad in Madrid. And when I was in Madrid, I think it was the first time I was so close to fast fashion in my life. Like instead of buying a sandwich for lunch, I would buy a shirt or like a pair of jeans because it was the same. It was €5. So at some point I was like, I don't get it. Like, what is this made of? Where is this made from? Like, who did this? Like, what is this? And I remember coming back home and showing my mom, and I was like, I don't get it. Like, why, when we did it, like when you did it, I know the prices and like the lifestyle people are having. Who made this so cheap, and where does they live? I think that was my big in my head. Like, I really don't get it, and I couldn't find much information. And it was basically a shocking and a very hard moment, getting to know that the world is not what I'm used to, and that the world is huge, and that the economical power is apparently much bigger and important than any other, and that lives are more valuable according to where you're born. So it was a very shock and sad moment. And then I realized the only way to change something that bothers you in your core, like really like burns your stomach and your blood, it's actually taking action and doing something. You cannot say I'm really bothered by this and live like a happy life. For me, it was, I cannot live a life knowing what I know, and also realizing that so much injustice and like abuse is happening. And that's when I started working with my mom full time after I finished my architecture career. She had this brand just as a catalog for like wholesale. And we created the Sustainable Fashion Association of the country in order to actually give other brands and projects, give them visibilization. After creating the association, I was still very curious on my basic human desire of designing and creating things. I love the colors and the shapes, and I love drawing, and it's a very part of who I am at the moment and who I'm always was. So we decided to create Kaitu as a way to experiment, to have our own trial version of what we think and how we think things should be. Kaitu is a contemporary sustainable fashion brand, and we call it like that because I always try to make it as close to human, close to everyone. It's not a high-elite brand. It's not a luxury brand. It's not unreachable. Totally the opposite. I always try to make everything, and with the materials we like experiment with, try to make them really affordable and really close to people. Yes, I 100% believe that. I think the most important thing is to be honest with yourself. And as long as you achieve that honesty and that self-value, self-love, and careness about like you and then the others, you can be a change maker because you're changing your own life. So when you start doing that, you project that, and there is no way that the other people will not see that. It's like light. If you can have the power and the value, like the boldness to be honest and change your own life, then you are a change maker. Loving yourself. If you love yourself, you are proud of yourself, you trust yourself, you listen to yourself, and you know every challenge you're given in the life you are deciding to live is something you're prepared for. But that is built with self-love. And if you love yourself, you're successful, because it's not easy. Like looking yourself at the mirror and actually loving fully, like this dark side that you don't love, or like these imperfections you see and everything. It's so hard. But when you do that, when you really love yourself and see yourself with compassion, you're successful, because you will be able to achieve everything, and you will be able to be transparent with yourself and honest with yourself and with your dreams and with your vision. So for me, that's success. Let's picture the ocean, and you see this amazing rock, huge one. It doesn't matter the size of the wave. The rock is a rock. The rock will not change, it will adapt. But at the core, it will be a rock. The same, for example, in the jungle. You don't see a tiger going around asking the other animals, am I a tiger? Do you see like my stripes? Are they tiger enough? Like my roar is tiger. The animals in nature, they just know. They don't need the reaffirmation. And I think that's what humans doesn't. We always need to be like, oh, you're so pretty. Oh, your hair looks like this. Oh, your teeth are so white. And then you are like, oh yeah, I'm good. I'm smart. And I think that's a part of identity, of being sure of who you are, not because other people tell you, but because you're very smart in history. And you know that because you're reading all these history books, and you know that. No one will come and say you're very good at math. You're going to say, no, I'm not. I'm good at history because I work a lot on being good at history. So I think that's the thing. We need to start being really sure of who we are, even if the entire world is like, no, you're not good. You can be, no, I'm good because I know it. Because I'm like a tiger in the jungle, and no one is going to tell me I'm a penguin. So I think when I'm in doubt of myself, I always think of that. Like, I picture the tiger in the jungle, and I'm like, yeah, he knows. Like, I know as well. And again, the hardest part and the most important is looking yourself at the mirror and being able to tell to yourself, I'm Yurak Fidlin, I'm Peruvian, and I'm proud of being a Peruvian. And just look at your eyes while you say that. Are you really proud? Like, why? Why are you so proud? And just being able to answer those questions to yourself is hard. But when you're able to do that, even if a tsunami goes by you, you will know who you are, just like that rock in the ocean. To trust yourself. I think through the years, I'm 20 now, I'm turning 30 next week, but through the years, in all my experience, what I could say to my like 15, 16 years old, it's like, you already know. And I think everyone knows deep down, like in their gut, in their heart, in their stomach, because for me, it's a very like passionate feeling. You know what you want to do, you know how you should do it. You just are afraid of listening to yourself. And that's a very common feeling because we have so much noise all around. So I would just recommend to listen closely to yourself and not be afraid of what you are telling to yourself, because deep down you already know. It's like you already lived the life you want, and you know how to do that. So don't be afraid of that. Really listen with a lot of attention and trust you 100% without a doubt.
Okay, so there was a lot in Yurak's story. So again, feel free to press pause and have some discussions together, either with a person sitting next to you or as a class, about some of the ideas that she raised. And she had a lot to say, and she's a very wise young woman. But you might want to just come back to those 3 points that I raised earlier about what was she feeling, how was she feeling? And she had quite a strong gut emotion in her. What was her burning question? And how did she turn her passion to purpose? So either take a moment to discuss, or again, just reflect on your own, and either press pause or we can continue together. Now, one of the things that Yurak was really helping to share was the importance of knowing who you are. And she talked a lot about loving yourself, about trusting yourself, about being proud of yourself, but really knowing who you are. And this just keeps coming back in this session about the authenticity of our actions, because the actions really are powerful if they come from our own space of authenticity. And so really starting to connect with who we are and what we believe in and what makes us tick, and then what we want to do, and turning that passion into purpose. Now, again, we do not need to be changing the world in our actions, because any action that we're doing is changing the world. So let's come back down to what it is that we are really motivated by. Now, she was an architect, but she could not stop thinking about the fact that her sandwich cost more than a pair of jeans. And that was what made her shift her direction from architecture into sustainable fashion, because she could not let that go. And having something that really holds you and that really burns inside you is so much of what this is all about. So, for example, Greta Thunberg, we know that she was just determined to keep sitting on that street and keep protesting until somebody listened. As I said, my next door neighbor Maya has written to every single supermarket and demanded to know why they're using this single-use plastic and when they will get rid of it. And she's had a meeting with every single or they get a letter back from every single supermarket and a meeting with some of the managing directors to discuss what their actions are. There's a young man called Lesson Matunkai who is obsessed with football, and he decided that every time he scored a goal, he would plant a tree. And now he's created a small enterprise called Trees for Goals. And because it's been growing and he's got a lot of people working now with him to also play football, but football for goals, every time he scores a goal, he plants 11 trees. And so he's growing a movement just by doing what he loves. So think about who you are, what you love, what makes you tick, and how you can turn that passion into something purposeful. So do one thing consistently. Being the change is a practice. It's a long term. It's not a quick thing. We're not going to be able to just suddenly shift everything. It's constant and consistent. Listen to your gut. Listen to what it is that makes you tick, and stand by your values, and listen to your calling, even if it's frustrating, because if it matters, you won't forget about it. So whatever it is that keeps you up at night or that niggles you, put your attention there and see where that takes you. So when we're thinking about the steps to being the change, we can sort of look in the future to how we want to be in the world, at what we see happening in the future. And then we can think about the burning question, where we are now, what it is that's making us tick. And then the first step, because we sometimes want to get to the end result. But when I talk about being the change, it's a long term. We don't know what the end result will be. What we do know is the first step we can take towards being there. So have that horizon so you know where you're headed, but think about the first step to get there. So what is your passion? And what is that first step towards that passion? So what's the first thing you can do to start turning your passion into purpose? And again, really think about what we mentioned at the start of this session, the story that you want to be a part of. Let's start tapping into the story of doing things differently, and let's help to pave the way in how we are and who we are for others to see that change can start from within by just being different as well as doing different. Thank you so much for your attention. I really hope this has stimulated some thoughts for you, hopefully stimulated some critical thinking questions, and hopefully allowed you to start by stopping, by standing back a little bit and thinking and connecting with your own emotions, with some of those questions that you have in your life, and that first step that you can take to being the change. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Take care.